Have you ever had a group of self-proclaimed powerful people try to control your life? Have you ever received meaningless, threatening letters, unreasonable rules made by a bunch of people who like to order around when you were the one who owns your house? This is a story about a group of people who think they have the right to control everything, about people who are oppressed by unreasonable rules, and about how one person can stand up and destroy a corrupt system from within. Have you ever had someone try to control your life? If so, sit back. I will tell you the story of how I brought down an entire HOA and won my freedom back. But don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any crazy HOA stories. I've never been one for trouble. After 30 years as sheriff, I just wanted a quiet life in retirement. Silver Pines, a small community in the Colorado mountains, was perfect, with its pine-lined streets, snowy winters, and the scent of sap in the summer. I had a modest cabin, a large yard, a porch for my morning coffee, and most importantly, Old Betsy, my tractor of more than 2 decades, not flashy, but an integral part of my life. At first, I didn't mind the HOA, a group that likes to make up meaningless rules for people who don't need their help. I lived here before they were formed, and they have no say in whether my tractor is legal or not. But then they started bothering me. I received a glossy letter with the HOA logo embossed in the top left corner, written in a very arrogant manner. "Dear Mr. Walker, as a Silver Pines resident, you are required to comply with the HOA rules. We have noted the following violations: an old farm vehicle parked on the property where it can be seen, failure to register as a HOA member as requested by the resident, failure to maintain landscaping consistent with general standards. Please submit the attached HOA membership fee and make any necessary adjustments by the end of the month to avoid further enforcement action. Sincerely, Linda Holloway, President, Silver Pines HOA Board of Directors." I laughed. They thought I would pay for the right to live on my own land? I bought the place before the HOA existed, and I had no business playing their nonsense. I tossed the letter aside, thinking it was just a minor annoyance, but I was wrong. The letters kept coming, taped to my truck, under my gate, even to Bear's doghouse, my old Labrador. Same patronizing tone, same ridiculous list of violations, same threats of enforcement action. Then they started showing up. One Saturday afternoon, as I was sipping a beer on the porch, Linda Holloway showed up with Frank Delaney, a middle-aged man in a crisp polo shirt and beige khakis, who looked like he'd stepped out of a How to Be a Badass manual. Linda smiled insincerely, standing in my path like she owned the place. I didn't invite them in. I didn't even bother to get up. I didn't bother listening. Linda harped on about community rules and the consequences of non-cooperation, while Frank pointed at Old Betsy, insisting that she didn't fit in with a high-class neighborhood like Silver Pines. I looked at him, then at the tractor sitting quietly in the sunset, its rust streaks like the medals of a veteran. They called it a visual hazard. I called it a part of my life. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. I just smiled, raised my beer, and wished them a good afternoon before turning and walking into the house, leaving Linda and Frank standing there, frustrated that they couldn't force me to submit immediately. I thought that was it. I thought they would give up. But I had underestimated the arrogance of petty power holders, and I didn't know that in a few days my tractor would be a pile of ashes, and from that moment on, I would never sit still again. The letters didn't stop. They kept coming. Not just in the mailbox, but taped to the door, under the windshield wipers, even on the dog kennel door. At first they were full of false politeness, but gradually became more aggressive, with phrases like compulsory enforcement, legal action, progressive fines. They made me laugh, like a kid who learned a few legal terms and thought he could threaten a retired sheriff. But then Linda decided that paperwork wasn't enough. If I ignored their warnings, they would come directly to my house. On Monday morning, Linda showed up, this time dragging 3 HOA members, all looking like clones of herself, stiff suits, fake smiles, arrogant eyes. I was checking old Betsy's motives when they stopped at the gate, lined up like a group of insurance agents just out of a consumer manipulation convention. Linda stepped forward, a thick folder in her hand, her smug look on her face, confident that this time I wouldn't be able to refuse. She began in her familiar, soft but forceful tone, talking about community spirit, aesthetic standards, and residential responsibilities. I didn't respond, just leaned against the tractor listening. But then Frank took a step forward, raised his hand, and pointed at old Betsy as if she were a wild animal that needed to be exterminated. "This tractor is a flagrant violation of the HOA's aesthetic rules," he announced, his voice full of triumph as if he had just caught me in the act. "You have been warned multiple times, and now we have no choice but to take enforcement action." I stared at him, trying not to laugh. A guy in khakis, working part-time for the HOA, was going to order a sheriff with 30 years of crime-busting experience? My silence made them uncomfortable. Robert, a bald guy with an overtrimmed mustache, stepped forward, his voice commanding. "You have 7 days to move it. If you don't, we'll fine you and tow it without your consent." I blinked, then bent down to continue screwing on Betsy's engine, ignoring them completely. The silence stretched on, and Linda clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. Finally, she announced that I would receive formal notice in the mail before they left, barely hiding her irritation. But I knew they weren't done yet. 3 days later, I saw a ticket taped to the middle of my truck's windshield. $500 for violating Regulation 14B by keeping an out-of-date farm vehicle in a residential area. I laughed. Did they think I would pay for a meaningless law? But as I tore the paper away, I realized something. Linda and her minions were not going to give up easily. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Absolute obedience. A few days later, I noticed strange things. A silver SUV parked unusually long, its windows darkened to hide the person inside. A small camera hidden behind a fence that clearly didn't belong to me. At night, shadowy figures watched my house from a distance, whispering and quickly leaving when I stepped onto the porch. Then I understood. They didn't just want my tractor gone, they wanted me gone. I wasn't their ideal resident, unyielding, unaccepting of meaningless rules, and I was right. A week later, my old Betsy was nothing but ash. One night, I woke up in the dark, feeling that something was wrong. At first, I didn't know what had woken me, a vague sense of foreboding, a quiet unease that coursed through my veins. But then, as I breathed in, the smell hit me square in the face. Smoke, burning oil, burning rubber. For a split second, I couldn't believe what I was smelling, but when I jumped up, pulled back the curtains and looked outside, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Oh, Betsy, my tractor was in flames. The fire roared, devouring every layer of old silver paint, every familiar rust stain, every year of attachment. I rushed outside, barefoot on the cold, damp grass, the wind carrying a hot breath, the firelight reflecting off the glass, dancing on the wooden walls, stirring up the rage that surged inside me. And then I saw them. Linda Holloway, Frank Delaney, along with 3 others, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, smirking in the firelight. Linda was still in her expensive blazer, her smug expression obvious. They didn't need to say anything. I knew exactly what they were trying to say. "You see, Jim? Those who don't follow the rules of the Silver Pines HOA will suffer the consequences." They didn't need to say it. The fire was speaking for them. I stood there, the heat on my face, the firelight glinting off the silver paint of the old truck parked next to me. I could hear Betsy's tires pop, hear the metal creak as the heat rose. 20 years of sweat, grease, early mornings in the fields were turning to ash before my eyes. I clenched my hands into fists, not because I wanted to run at them, not because I was the type to solve problems with violence. I'd faced people far more dangerous than them, real criminals, murderers, drug dealers, people who played with human life. But I'd never felt so angry as I did now, not because of the tractor, not because of its material value, but because of the brazenness, the arrogance of those who thought they had the right to decide the lives of others. I took a deep, slow breath, keeping my anger from exploding. I didn't scream. I didn't lunge at them. I didn't give them the pleasure of seeing me lose control. I turned and walked into the house, closing the door behind me. I knew Linda thought she had won, that I had accepted defeat, that I understood who had the power here, but she didn't know that I wasn't the type to just take it easy. She had just started a war, and I never lost a war. I spent the night sitting at my desk, not sleeping a wink. Outside, the ashes of old Betsy still smoldered, a thin column of smoke rising in the morning mist. But I didn't look out the window. I didn't care about the pile of scrap metal outside. I was busy planning. They thought this was a power struggle, a little game between a bunch of control freaks and a stubborn old man who refused to submit, but they were wrong from the start. They didn't know I'd been playing this game my whole life. First, I checked the security cameras. I wasn't the type to live in a neighborhood full of nosy, no-nonsense people. I had 6 cameras around my house, not to protect my property. I never worried about petty thieves, but to monitor anyone who might be up to something dirty. And tonight, I had just what I needed. I replayed the video, frame by frame, second by second. And then, right before old Betsy burst into flames, I saw a figure, Frank Delaney. The image was a little blurry from the fire, but I didn't need any more proof. I recognized his gait, the way he glanced around like a petty thief, and most importantly, I recognized the lighter in his hand. He stood there for a few seconds, crouched down, and then a flash, a small spark danced on his fingertip. A second later, it caught something that might have been an oilcloth or newspaper, and instantly flames began engulfing Betsy's front tire. I paused the video, zoomed in, and took a screenshot. But I didn't stop there. I opened a drawer and pulled out the file I'd kept on the Silver Pines HOA. During all the harassment, I'd started gathering information. People like Linda Holloway didn't just impose unreasonable rules on their neighbors, they always had things they wanted to hide. I flipped through the pages of my notes, going over each one I'd written down. Building violations. Linda had expanded the HOA office without a permit. A city inspection could have shut it down immediately. Financial irregularities. The HOA had secretly increased membership fees without proper notice, taking advantage of residents who didn't know the law. Fire safety violations. They had allowed gas tanks to be placed next to homes without safety inspections, turning the neighborhood into a time bomb if the wrong spark were to appear. I took pictures of everything, backed it up to my hard drive, and emailed a copy to myself just in case. They had made more mistakes than they thought, and I was just a hair's breadth away from collapsing their entire system. Now, all I needed was a phone call. I picked up the phone and dialed Mike Reynolds, the current chief of police in Silver Pines, a man I'd trained when he was a rookie. If anyone could help me with this, it was him. The phone rang for a moment, then someone picked up. I didn't say hello, didn't beat around the bush. "I have an arson case for you, Mike." The next morning, I drove to the Silver Pines police station. The town was quiet as usual, but I knew this was the day everything would change. The station wasn't far from my house, an old red brick building that looked unremarkable to outsiders, but to me it was where I'd spent 30 years of my life policing this small town. It was mine. I parked, turned off the engine, grabbed the hard drive containing all the evidence, and walked in. No one stopped me because they knew me. The young officers bowed as I passed, some addressing me by my old title, "Good morning, Sheriff Walker." I no longer held that title, but I didn't argue. Because this morning I wasn't coming here as a resident oppressed by the HOA. I was coming as a justice seeker. The door to Sheriff Mike Reynolds's office opened as I approached. He stood up from his desk, a smile on his face, older than the last time I'd seen him. Mike had been a young officer under me, a man of potential but also a practical man. He knew how to pick sides in important battles, and this morning I was going to show him how much the battles were worth fighting. I set the hard drive on the desk and pulled up a chair. No need for pleasantries, no need for explanations. I opened his laptop, plugged in the hard drive, and showed him the truth. Frank Delaney, standing right in front of old Betsy, leaned over, lit the lighter, and left just before the flames erupted. A clear, unmistakable crime. Every sharp frame, every move, recorded. Mike froze. I saw his jaw tighten, his hands ball into fists. An arson in his town. But I didn't stop there. I continued to the HOA files. Financial violations. They had secretly increased fees without residents' consent, tricking them into paying for ridiculous landscape funds and special management fees. Safety violations. They had illegally approved the placement of gas tanks next to residential walls, turning the community into a time bomb waiting for a spark to explode. Legal violations. Linda had arbitrarily altered fire safety inspection records to avoid paying to fix serious violations. I said nothing more. I let the evidence speak for itself. Mike looked away from the screen and let out a slow breath. I could see him considering, but I knew he had no choice. The law was not something that could be bent to the HOA's will, and this morning I had put him in a position to act. Soon, the official investigation was launched. Officers were sent to the HOA headquarters to seize financial documents. Another team began checking the entire fire protection system of the community, seeing how many violations had gone unreported, and most importantly, they had enough evidence to arrest Frank Delaney. I didn't follow them out. I didn't need to see him handcuffed in front of the HOA office. I just sat in Mike's office, watching through the window as one police car after another pulled out of the parking lot. I knew this was just the beginning. I didn't have to wait long. The news spread faster than the fire Frank Delaney had started. Within 24 hours of the police's arrival, the entire town of Silver Pines had exploded in a storm of outrage. Residents began to talk. People who had never cared about HOAs, who had never considered themselves victims, now saw the truth. They weren't living in a peaceful, organized community. They were being ruled by a self-appointed clique, and Linda Holloway was the head of that kingdom. The next morning, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching everything unfold exactly as I had predicted. A news van was parked in front of the HOA office, cameras were set up, and a reporter with neat brown hair and a sharp smile was talking into the camera. The Silver Pines community is reeling from the news that the HOA has been accused of serious abuse of power. An official investigation has been launched after evidence of arson targeting private property was uncovered. According to police sources, the prime suspect, Frank Delaney, was arrested last night. The camera panned to the police station, where Frank had been taken just hours earlier. He was no longer wearing his HOA code enforcement uniform, just a plain suit and a pale face as he was led away in handcuffs. They didn't get much of Frank, But what mattered most wasn't what was on TV, it was what happened inside the interrogation room. Frank wasn't loyal. He wasn't the type to take the fall for someone else. I knew he would break as soon as the pressure got to him, and sure enough, before dawn, he had confessed. Frank Delaney officially admitted that Linda Holloway had ordered my tractor burned. He said she didn't tell him to do it directly. Linda wasn't stupid. She just suggested that if old Betsy didn't disappear, she could find a way to deal with it. Frank, like a loyal dog, understood the message exactly as Linda intended. He lit the fire himself. He made himself a criminal, and when he realized the police had enough evidence to convict him, he had no choice but to reveal the mastermind behind the crime, Linda Holloway. Meanwhile, outside the HOA office, the situation was no better. Residents who had supported HOA Linda were starting to doubt. They had believed that the HOA kept their neighborhood safe, clean, and organized. But now they were faced with an undeniable truth. The people they trusted had taken advantage of them. People gathered outside the HOA office. Some carried the fine letters they had received, now crumpled with anger. A middle-aged woman stood before the cameras, holding up a $300 fine for planting the wrong type of flowers in front of her house. Another man, a former HOA security guard, said he was being forced to pay a special maintenance fee without ever seeing the HOA do any maintenance. My story was no longer personal. It was revolutionary. The outrage was widespread, and I knew that Linda could not hide much longer. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, feeling the satisfaction spread through my muscles. The game had changed, and this time she was no longer the one in charge. I had always believed that power did not turn people into monsters, it only revealed their true colors. And Linda Holloway, during her time in power at Silver Pines, had believed that she was above it all. She believed that with enough self-imposed rules and a loyal group of people like Frank Delaney to enforce them, she could control everything, everyone. But what happened that morning proved that she had never really been in control of anything. I saw it the moment the first police car pulled up in front of the HOA office. Linda stepped out, her suit perfectly tailored, her blonde hair pulled back into a bun as if she were still the queen of Silver Pines. But this time there was no crown on her head, no admiring glances from the residents who fawned over her whenever she passed. There was only silence. A silence as thick and heavy as a storm, about to sweep away everything. Sheriff Mike Reynolds, a copy of the arrest warrant in his hand, approached her. I'd seen him do this 100 times before, and I knew this moment carried a different weight. Not a petty thief, not a drunken troublemaker, but HOA Linda, the woman who believed the law couldn't touch her. She didn't react immediately. Her face was rigid, partly in horror, partly in disbelief. I saw her clench her fists, her fingers trembling on the edge of her coat, as if clinging to the power she once held. But when Reynolds read out the charges of complicity in arson, abuse of power, and financial fraud, everything fell apart. She stammered something, a flimsy excuse, a meaningless excuse, but no one listened. The residents who had feared her now stood there, staring, no one speaking, no one defended her, no one tried to justify her. She was alone. Then the handcuffs were on her wrists, and that was it. But the collapse of HOA Linda wasn't the only thing that happened that day. The HOA was officially dissolved. The decision came just hours after HOA Linda was arrested. The financial records were investigated and revealed hundreds of illegal collections, fees that residents had paid that no one knew where they were going. The safety violations were listed in a report that was longer than the meaningless rules they had imposed on people for years. The HOA was no longer an organization that represented the interests of the residents. It was a machine that drained their money and freedom. and when no one was willing to protect it, it collapsed under the weight of its own sins. I stood on my porch, watching the HOA fine signs come down one by one. The surveillance cameras Linda had secretly placed in places no one would notice were removed. The meaningless warning letters she had sent were scattered on the streets, blown away by the wind like the remnants of a fallen empire. Silver Pines was liberated. I had lived in this town longer than anyone in the HOA. I had seen it change, grow, become a place many called home, but I had also seen it lose its freedom bit by bit as people like Linda Holloway sought to put shackles on every resident, every front yard, every house number plate. They had wanted to make Silver Pines their kingdom, and they had until they went too far. When the HOA collapsed, it was as if the neighborhood had been released from years of invisible control. No more threatening letters showing up at doors, no more unreasonable fees, no more polo-shirted patrollers documenting meaningless violations. Silver Pines had changed, and for the first time in a long time, Silver Pines no longer belonged to some self-appointed council. It belonged to the people who should have owned it in the first place. To the people who lived here. I leaned back in my chair, sipped my coffee, and watched the sunlight filter through the pine trees. A wind blew, carrying the cool mountain air, bringing with it a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. Freedom. I spent the morning sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, enjoying the new quiet. No more prying eyes. No more sour voices trying to enforce rules. Just neighbors who for the first time seemed genuinely at ease, walking the streets they had been forced to maintain to a standard that wasn't theirs. The changes were immediate. The meaningless signs put up by the HOA were taken down. A man down the street who had been fined for not having the right shade of gray for his front door was repainting his front door a bright red, as bright as the smile on his face. A few other houses were starting to repaint their walls, no longer worried about the warning letters that would appear in their mailboxes the next morning. In front of the old HOA headquarters, a group of people gathered, laughing and talking about the future, turning this place into a real community center, not a bastion of control freaks. I slowly stood up, walked down the porch, and headed for the back barn. Inside, a shiny new tractor. Betsy 2. Stronger, faster, but most importantly, it was a symbol. They could burn what was mine, but they couldn't force me to submit. I ran my hand along the steel frame, smiling. I'd lost something precious, but gained so much more. That afternoon, as I inspected the Betsy 2 engine, Sheriff Mike Reynolds stopped by. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a familiar smirk on his face. I knew why he'd come. They wanted me back, not as sheriff, but as an advisor, someone to help the community understand their rights so they'd never be controlled by the likes of the HOA again. I fell silent, looking around. Silver Pines has changed, but to keep that change going, someone needs to step up. I nodded. The next day, I started my new job. No more HOA office. We met in Central Park, which was no longer Linda's boring meeting place, but a place for the residents themselves. People came, sat in a circle, talked about what they wanted to do with the town now that they actually had control over it. I just sat there, listened, guided when needed. They were no longer bound by meaningless rules. They were free to decide for themselves what was best for their community. I looked around, saw my neighbors laughing, planning improvements, discussing how they could help each other without some oppressive organization standing over them. And I knew I was doing the right thing. Betsy 2 was waiting for me at home, and I knew I still had work to do. But right now I just sat back, looked at the people, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Peace.